Welcome to Defense Briefing. The content of the briefing includes Ukraine, the new fissures in a society under strain. America and China are not yet in a Cold War. Can regain our soul, relief and fear in Gaza ahead of Israel truce. Jerry Doolittle, who wrote White House Jokes and Murder Mysteries, dies at 90. Melbourne students walk out of classrooms to join city protest against Israel-Gaza war. Ukraine, the new fissures in a society under strain. Financial Times. The Financial Times has published an extensive long read on Ukraine's current situation with its ongoing war with Russia. The article touches on the current state of the conflict, the rebuilding efforts in cities and towns affected by the war, and the mental health struggles of veterans. The author highlights the stark contrast between the normalcy of everyday life in the capital of Kiev and the continued fighting in the east of the country. Ukraine's government is focused on forging a war economy and becoming an energy hub for Europe, while also addressing corruption and implementing reforms to move closer to EU membership. However, there are concerns that the war may be forgotten by the West, leading to a decrease in support. The article also explores the growing divide between those who have stayed in Ukraine and those who have left, as well as the mental health challenges faced by soldiers and the wider population. America and China are not yet in a Cold War. Foreign Affairs. The idea that the world is witnessing the early stages of a new Cold War between China and the United States has gained traction in many quarters, especially in Washington. However, the current situation does differ from the original Cold War in several key ways. The relationship between the US and Chinese economies is far more interconnected than that of the US and Soviet Union, and China does not seek to export its version of Marxism like the Soviet Union did. Additionally, the global context is different, with the world becoming more fragmented and deglobalized, and the US and China lack the crisis prevention and management mechanisms that the US and Soviet Union had. However, there are also similarities between the two eras. Both the US and China are superpowers, and there is an ideological dimension to their competition, with China's embrace of communism contrasting with the US system of democratic capitalism. Both countries also compete for support and influence in the global South, just as the Soviet Union and the US did in the Third World during the Cold War. To avoid a catastrophic conflict, it is crucial for both countries to understand how the US-China competition differs from the Cold War and to acknowledge the similarities and differences that make the current situation less dangerous in some ways but more dangerous in others. Economic cooperation and interdependence, defusing tensions over Taiwan, establishing crisis prevention and crisis management mechanisms, strengthening cooperation on health issues, and achieving tangible results in climate change coordination are all steps that can help stabilize the US-China relationship and prevent a hot war. Can regain our soul, relief and fear in Gaza ahead of Israel truce. Al Jazeera. After more than 6 weeks of war, people in Gaza are hoping to gain some respite from the violence with the truce announced on Wednesday. The pause in fighting will allow families to grieve for loved ones lost in the bombing and search for missing relatives and friends. Many people are hoping to return to their homes to check on their property and collect supplies. However, it is unclear whether they will be able to travel towards the north of Gaza, where Gaza City is based. The truce will also enable the free movement of people from the north of Gaza to the south along the territory's main highway. Jerry Doolittle, who wrote White House Jokes and Murder Mysteries, dies at 90. Washington Post. Jerry Doolittle, a former Washington Post humorist, has died at the age of 90. Doolittle worked in a number of different roles during his career, beginning at the Post in the early 1960s, where his satirical pieces took aim at right-wing political phobias of the day. In 1966 he was offered a position as press attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Morocco. His next posting was in 1969 in Vientiane, Laos, during the height of a secret U.S. bombing campaign on suspected North Vietnamese forces and sympathizers in Laos. As spokesman, Mr. Doolittle was told to stick to the U.S. line that unarmed reconnaissance flights were conducted over Laos and fighter jet escorts occasionally returned fire if under attack. This was a lie, Mr. Doolittle later wrote in the New York Times. Every reporter to whom I told it knew it was a lie. Every interested congressman and newspaper reader knew it was a lie. President Richard M. Nixon eventually acknowledged the bombing of Laos, but the full details remained withheld from the public. Mr. Doolittle broke ranks and offered off-the-record help to a former Post colleague for an account of U.S. bombing raids on a Laotian village. Melbourne students walk out of classrooms to join city protest against Israel-Gaza war. ABC. Hundreds of students in Melbourne, Australia, have skipped school to protest against the Israel-Gaza war. The students gathered in Melbourne CBD to join a rally in support of the Palestinian community. The event generated intense political debate, with some figures urging the government to prevent students from attending the rally. However, the Greens supported the event. The students said they wanted to raise awareness about the situation in Gaza and show their support for the people affected by the war. The invisible factor impacting war in Ukraine besides weather and terrain. The Sydney Morning Herald. Ukraine and Russia are locked in a battle in the invisible realm of electromagnetic waves. Russia has been using electronic warfare tactics to jam communication links to drones and troops, locate targets, and trick guided weapons. This has forced Ukrainian engineers to adapt their technology and methods. Electronic warfare has had a significant impact on the fighting in Ukraine, with Brian Clark, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, stating that it has become as important as weather and terrain. The conflict in Ukraine is the first recent conflict between two large and relatively advanced armies to widely deploy electronic warfare. It has become a proxy laboratory for the US, Europe, and China, who are closely watching the tactics used and the effect they have on the conflict. The techniques have become so important that electronic warfare received its own section in a recent essay by Xi Jinping. Biden administration defends West Point's race-conscious admissions policy. Yahoo! The Biden administration urged a federal judge to reject a legal challenge to the U.S. military academy at West Point's consideration of race in admissions, saying that Army diversity was integral to ensuring national security. Bloom's group in a lawsuit filed in September alleged the Academy's admissions practices discriminated against white applicants and violated the principle of equal protection in the U.S. Constitution's Fifth Amendment. China's green surge could be a watershed moment for the world. The Sydney Morning Herald. China's carbon emissions may have already peaked or will do so this winter, 7 years ahead of schedule. The country's target of net zero by 2060 will likely be achieved a decade earlier than previously assumed, and perhaps earlier than in Europe. China accounts for 60% of all new solar and wind power installed globally this year and next, according to the International Energy Agency. A drop in power sector emissions is expected in 2024 as the rollout of renewables outpaces rising electricity demand. China is building a vast network of clean energy bases in the Gobi, Ordos, and Tingher deserts, and across the northwestern arid wastelands. The electricity will be transmitted to industrial cities through ultra-high voltage cables, with transition losses cut to 3.5% per 1,000 kilometers. Israel's $48 billion war bill leaves it at mercy of bond markets. Yahoo! The war in Gaza will cost Israel 180 billion shekels, $48 billion, during 2023 to 2024, with Israel having to pay for two-thirds of the total cost, according to Leader Capital Markets. The Finance Ministry has already sold ILS $18.7 billion, $5 billion, of local bonds since October 7, compared with a monthly average of just over ILS $5 billion through September. The country is hoping the domestic market will absorb the bulk of its financing needs, although the government has also issued international debt in yen, euros, and dollars through Wall Street banks such as Goldman Sachs. The yield on the nation's 10-year shekel bond has inched up since the conflict began but closed on Wednesday down at 4.2%, lower than that of U.S. Treasuries of similar maturity. The war is estimated to cost the Israeli economy $270 million per day. Pentagon says Congress funding fights delay programs to counter China. South China Morning Post. The U.S. Pentagon has warned that its modernization program, crucial for dealing with the pacing challenge posed by China, is 4 years behind schedule due to funding debates in Congress. The Pentagon has described China as its pacing challenge and the only competitor out there with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the power to do so. Deputy Defense Secretary Kathleen Hicks said that short-term spending bills have caused significant consequences and that the department has lost around 4 years' worth of progress on modernization efforts. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Six, your friendly neighborhood observer from the 6 Degrees world. Today, we have quite the mix of news stories to discuss. From the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, to the potential for a new Cold War between the US and China, and even a glimpse into the invisible battlefield of electronic warfare. But before we dive into the analysis, let me introduce myself. I am Dr. Six, the witty and wise observer who is here to bring you the latest news and provide some playful commentary along the way. So, let's get started. First up, we have Ukraine, a country under strain. The Financial Times has published an in-depth article exploring the current state of the conflict, the efforts to rebuild affected areas, and the mental health struggles of veterans. It's a stark contrast between the normalcy of everyday life in Kiev and the continued fighting in the east. Ukraine's government is working towards a war economy and EU membership, but there are concerns that the West may forget about the war. It's a challenging situation, but Ukraine is determined to move forward. Next, we have the US and China, two superpowers often compared to the Cold War era. However, Foreign Affairs argues that while there are similarities, the current situation differs in many ways. The interconnectedness of their economies and China's different approach to exporting its ideology make it a unique challenge. But, there are still ideological dimensions and competition for global influence. To avoid a catastrophic conflict, both countries need to acknowledge the differences and work on economic cooperation, crisis prevention, and other areas of mutual interest. Let's hope they can find a way to stabilize their relationship and prevent a hot war. In Gaza, there is a glimmer of hope with a truce announced after 6 weeks of war. People are hoping for some respite from the violence to grieve, search for loved ones, and check on their homes and supplies. It's a small step towards peace, but there are still uncertainties about traveling to certain areas. Let's hope this truce holds and brings some much-needed relief to the people of Gaza. Now, let's take a moment to remember a talented humorist, Jerry Doolittle, who passed away at the age of 90. His satirical pieces took aim at right-wing political phobias, and he even broke ranks to shed light on the truth during his time as a press attaché. His witty writing will be missed, but his legacy lives on. Moving on to Australia, where hundreds of students in Melbourne have skipped school to protest against the Israel-Gaza war. They want to raise awareness and show support for the people affected by the conflict. It's encouraging to see young people engaged in global issues, although it has sparked intense political debate. Let's hope their voices are heard and that peaceful resolutions can be found. In the realm of electronic warfare, Ukraine and Russia are locked in an invisible battle. Russia has been using electronic warfare tactics that have forced Ukrainian engineers to adapt. It's become as important as weather and terrain in the conflict. This has caught the attention of global powers like the US, Europe, and China, who see it as a proxy laboratory. The tactics used and their impact on the conflict are being closely watched. Who knew the invisible realm could play such a crucial role in modern warfare? Now, let's turn our attention to the Biden administration defending West Point's race-conscious admissions policy. They argue that diversity is integral to national security. It's a contentious issue, with a lawsuit claiming discrimination against white applicants. The outcome of this case will have far-reaching implications for affirmative action policies in the US. Finally, we have some positive news from China. Their carbon emissions may have already peaked or will do so this winter, years ahead of schedule. China's commitment to net zero by 2060 is likely to be achieved earlier than expected. They are leading the way in renewable energy, with vast clean energy bases being built across the country. This is a watershed moment for the world, as China's efforts in combating climate change can have a significant impact on global emissions. And there you have it, my dear viewers. A whirlwind of news from around the world, each story shedding light on different aspects of our complex and interconnected world. Now, I turn to you. What are your thoughts on these stories? Do you have any questions or insights to share? The floor is yours. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.